When tissues in the body are injured, sensory nerves carry a pain signal to the spinal cord. As the injury message spreads, the brain is then bombarded with the sensory signal that we know of as pain.
In the face of actual or impending tissue damage, it's fantastically useful to have a warning system to tell you that this is happening and to drive a behavioral strategy to minimize the impact of that danger. So clearly, if you pick up a plate of food that's too hot, your immediate reaction is to put it down.
But sometimes this process is interrupted and the pain signal is switched off.
Stress-induced analgesia is an example of this endogenous pain suppression system kicking in. It's a very common experience that people subject themselves to quite horrific injuries, and at the time of the injury, they don't report pain.
The human brain utilizes a natural opiate-like system to interrupt the pain signal.
Under those circumstances, it would be more logical for the brain to suppress the activity in its pain signaling systems so that it can concentrate its efforts on the important business of repair and removing oneself from the immediate danger.
This reaction helped one man survive a potentially fatal hunting accident.
There's always that thing that happens that you just don't know, you don't plan on happening.
Alaska, one of the last great wilderness frontiers on our planet. This vast state is home to some of the most extreme conditions known to humankind. In the winter, temperatures can drop to as much as 45 degrees below zero. Summer only lasts for 3 months. Former school principal Dan Eide grew up in Montana. He moved to Alaska 25 years ago, the attraction of living off the land, a strong part of his family tradition. In September 2001, Dan set out on a 2-week moose hunting expedition. He flew inland towards the inhospitable Chugach mountain range of south central Alaska, an area with no road access, an area where Dan would be totally isolated.
To be a good hunter, you have to be able to shoot well, you have to be able to track and to find the game that you're looking for. And then even if you do everything right, things can just go wrong, and that's where the luck comes in. I just shot the biggest bull of my life. I'm by myself. It's going to be a long day.
3 days into the hunt, he shot a large bull moose. He would have to butcher the meat where it fell and carry it back to his airplane.
When I first got over the moose, I took out my knife, set my pack down, laid my rifle down, and the first cut of the moose was a circular cut because I was getting ready to skin the animal. And I put the knife in, and I was pulling down, and it came through the hide and continued to go, and I drove the knife into my calf just above my boot line.
Dan had plunged the knife in all the way to the hilt.
The knife, as it went in, I never felt. As I looked down and saw the knife all the way into the handle in my leg, it really didn't hurt.
His pain signal was interrupted. Stress-induced analgesia had kicked in. Isolated and hundreds of miles from the nearest hospital, Dan was faced with a very difficult choice. If he pulled the knife out, he risked bleeding to death. An embedded object can actually block the blood flow. But if he left the blade in, he could do even more damage.
If I would kick it or hit it with something and possibly cut across my leg and cut tendons, I would have been in worse shape. Normally you would leave the knife in if you were someplace where you could have it taken care of. You'd leave the knife in, but I had too many things to do and too far to walk. So I pulled the knife out and basically ignored it for a while.
Dan decided to try and finish butchering the moose, but the wound began to cause him problems. It was more serious than he thought.
I would watch it a little bit, and it was draining down the inside of my pant leg, so I really didn't notice a lot of blood until it filled up my boot. And then as a little bit later, it was flowing over the top of my boot, so I figured it was time to do something. I had to take care of the bleeding.
If he stayed where he was, excessive bleeding would lead to loss of consciousness. If he passed out, he was at risk from hypothermia. Dan had to get back to his campsite. Inside his plane, he had a first aid kit. It was his only hope. With his stab wound still bleeding profusely, Dan began to walk back to his plane, wading across 4 freezing rivers. Back at camp, he dug out his medical kit. A friend had given him a suture needle. Sewing the wound together might just stop the bleeding.
I had a cooking stove, and I put a pot of water on to boil so I could sterilize and kind of wash the wound a little bit. I just walked across 3 or 4 rivers, so I'd been washed fairly clean, but I wanted to make sure there was nothing left in the wound. I just got hot water and gauze pads and scrubbed it a little bit, and then it was time to start trying to suture it.
But this time, the pain of sewing himself up would far exceed the pain of stabbing himself.
I knew that there was nothing that I was going to be able to use to kill the pain, and so I just stitched it without anything.
The anticipation of inflicting further tissue damage on the stab wound heightened his stress levels. His fear made the pain even worse.
The first stitch was very painful. I was amazed on the first stitch how far the needle lifted up before it finally poked through the skin on the first one. The pain of the first 3, I was, and sweating, and I was starting to get sick to my stomach, and and then I was maybe cold. I'm not for sure, but my hands didn't seem to work real well.
On the 4th stitch, Dan was shaking so much, he pulled the suture free.
Sweat was just pouring down my face, and so I was in a lot of pain, and that was about all I could handle at that point. So I just laid back and laid down for a while. And I don't know how long I laid there, but I laid there long enough to get cold, and I thought, well, if I'm getting cold, I must be feeling better. So I sat back up and put in 3 more stitches.
Dan had suffered a massive blood loss. This, combined with the stress of the last few hours, had left him physically exhausted. He was too weak to attempt to fly his plane back to help.
After I sewed myself up, I had to, I laid down and ate something and drank juice, and because I had given blood before, and you feel a little bit sick sometimes when you give blood, and they give you orange juice and stuff. So I knew I had to just take it easy for a little while.
10 hours after the accident, Dan decided he was well enough to fly back to Valdez, the nearest town with a medical center.
When I cut myself, there was no one there to take care of me, and so I was going to have to do what I did by myself. And most of us that live up here like to think of ourselves as independent and can handle anything that comes along. So to admit that I stuck myself in the leg was not one of my fonder memories.